My name's Nicola Hamoud. I'm one of the credentialed diabetes educators at Diabetes SA. I'd like to introduce the two members of our health service team who are upstairs with us today. We've got Fiona Benton standing in the doorway there. She's our General Manager of Diabetes SA. And we've also got Parind Vora just in the front here. She's an accredited practicing dietitian and also a credentialed diabetes educator. This year, National Diabetes Week occurs between the 13th and the 19th of July, so it ends today. Our special focus this year is food and exercise as medicine. We're really privileged to hear from two guest speakers today. Cashman, who's going to explore the benefits of incorporating grains and legumes into your diet and how these foods may influence your blood glucose levels, and Dr. Parind Vora, who's going to discuss the benefits of regular physical activity and considerations for people living with type 1 diabetes. Before I introduce our first guest, I've just got a small presentation just to speak with you about some of the considerations around exercise and type 1 diabetes. So we know the benefits of exercise and they're very well documented. One of the landmark studies, the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial, or the DCCT, which was held between 1983 and 1989, clearly showed that maintaining near normal HbA1c levels limits the progression of complications of diabetes, including reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Regular exercise helps build muscles and reduces body fat. It also enhances our mood, reduces stress and anxiety levels, and increases energy levels. It definitely improves our sleep and keeps our joints and muscles flexible, and can also improve our quality of life. But when we plan our exercise, we have a few considerations, because we know the benefits of exercise are absolutely outweigh the negatives. But when you have type 1 diabetes, there are always going to be some considerations. And he's just pondering what type of exercise he wants to do. So our considerations, one of the first things we have to ask ourselves, what is our initial fitness level? How active are we? It's really important when commencing any exercise regime that your current fitness is considered in order to make realistic goals. Discussing this with your healthcare team and understanding any pre-existing cardiovascular conditions or limitations is essential to help you achieve your goal. And I really don't think that this is this dog's choice to walk this way on the treadmill, so I'm not sure what his goal might be. But definitely when we think about the considerations around exercise, we really have to ensure that we are well enough to commence that exercise. So it's really worthwhile checking with your doctor, who's going to consider not only your blood glucose levels, but also any diabetes-related complications, including the condition of your heart and blood vessels. For high blood pressure that's difficult to stabilise, vigorous exercise, particularly resistance training or of vigorous intensity, should really be avoided until blood pressure is actually managed. And perhaps the doctor might also think about introducing or putting you through a stress test as well. But once we've decided on the type of exercise we want to do and we've got a clearance from our doctor, one of the next steps is trying to figure out the intensity and duration of the exercise we're going to try and go for really. Because a person with type 1 diabetes, it is a constant balancing act to keep blood glucose levels within a target range. Understanding the intensity and the duration of exercise better helps us understand how the body is going to use the energy stores that it has. This is vital for someone with diabetes because we know that preparation is definitely key. In anaerobic exercise, which comprises of brief strength-based activities such as sprinting or bodybuilding, the energy requirements cause higher intensities of muscular contraction. For some people with type 1 diabetes, this can result in higher blood glucose levels initially and also during the activity, but later on it can actually cause blood glucose levels to drop and hypoglycemia can occur. For aerobic activities, which are characterised by low rates of muscular contraction, but are more prolonged, such as running, walking, swimming and cycling, the energy supply needed is manufactured in a more sustainable way. In some with type 1 diabetes, this can actually cause hypoglycemia to occur actually during the activity and also several hours afterwards as well. Because our body uses energy in different ways for different activities, we can better determine insulin doses and carbohydrate requirements better if we actually understand the activity. So how do we work out how to modify our insulin and carbohydrate intake? Basically monitoring our blood glucose levels. By monitoring blood glucose levels prior to the activity, this is really vital as exercise increases our body's sensitivity to insulin and can cause hypoglycemia. How we monitor blood glucose levels, it can be done either using a blood glucose meter or also using a continuous glucose monitoring system. And we know that a blood glucose level of 4 millimoles or below is classified as hypoglycemia, or if you are symptomatic of hypoglycemia as well. If you are exploring new activities, it may be worthwhile to contact your healthcare team to talk about the use of a continuous glucose monitor. Most services can generally discuss your options in that regard, and it might really be beneficial to you. Depending upon what you read and the recommendations around frequency of monitoring blood glucose measures during and after activity, there's lots of different information out there. But one of the consistent messages, I guess, is monitoring before you start your activity. If it's a prolonged activity, every 30 minutes during the activity, and then every 2 hours for the 4 hours following the completion of that activity, and perhaps also overnight as well. Monitoring is key because that's really going to help you understand how your body is reacting or responding to that exercise regime. And we know that in type 1 diabetes, generally you can never monitor enough. So we worry about hypoglycemia when we are exercising and we have diabetes because we know that hypoglycemia is the most severe acute complication of intensive insulin treatment. The absorption of the subcutaneously injected insulin may be increased with exercise, predominantly due to the rise in body temperature and the increase in skeletal muscle blood flow. Therefore, it's really important to consider when you are exercising in relation to the timing of your insulin injections as well. If a person wears an insulin pump, again, that's another consideration. Will you wear the pump for the duration of the exercise, or will you choose to remove the pump during the exercise or activity? Depending on what you decide, obviously that's going to have implications on blood glucose levels. So it's something that you can definitely figure out with your team, and obviously lots of experimenting. Now this morning we're really fortunate to have Chris Cashman with us. We're just waiting for him to arrive actually, and he's going to talk to us about the benefits of nutrition and being prepared and how we actually use lots of different energy sources. But for anyone starting a new or existing exercise program, it would be of benefit to access a dietitian, just in regards to your nutrition requirements. For a person with type 1 diabetes, I would definitely suggest that this would be even more beneficial. Working with a dietitian who understands diabetes, and particularly how the insulin you're using to manage your diabetes works, is probably one of the really key important points. If you can access a dietitian who also has an interest in exercise, then that's even better. Ensuring you're hydrated and adequately nourished is also vital, as this is going to support your body to ensure that you perform at your peak. This is one of my favourite slides. We talk a lot around the complications of diabetes, and we know that for people with diabetes, it is really important to reduce our risk of complications. Daily self-checks of your feet are encouraged, as well as 6 to 12 monthly checks with a podiatrist. So when starting any exercise regime, it's really important to wear the appropriate footwear. It's also advisable to check your feet after the activity to look for signs of blisters or breaks that can be caused due to that constant shearing. So I don't recommend walking on a treadmill in 5-inch heels, I'm going to guess. Obviously, our other considerations, choosing an activity that you're going to be able to enjoy and achieve. So obviously for the puppy, this is a bit too out of his league. Always remember to stay sun smart and wear sunscreen and a hat where possible. Keep hydrated and consider wearing some form of medical identification as well, perhaps medic alert. Obviously don't exercise if you're unwell is another key message. And at the end of the day, the whole point around exercise is to make us feel good, so we want to be able to reap the rewards. Some people that can really assist you in thinking about or considering an exercise program, maybe an exercise physiologist, and tapping into their expertise if you haven't exercised for a while might be something that you want to consider. Because who knew a hippo could do sit-ups? Not me. So, we're still waiting for Chris to arrive, I think, so we do have a few minutes. If anybody would like to share any information around exercise or any useful tips for the audience, has anybody started any recent exercise regime? Anyone starting to do marathon training or running or swimming or anything? Has anybody noticed that when they do exercise that their blood glucose levels may dip afterwards or during? No? Yeah? A couple of hands? Yeah. How quickly from the start of your exercise have you noticed that blood glucose levels may dip? Or do often you see a rise first? You see a rise? So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Chris Cashman. Chris is an accredited practicing dietitian working in the role of project officer with the Grains and Legumes Nutrition Council based in Sydney. They're the leading authority on nutrition and the health benefits of grains and legumes. Previously, Chris has gained a range of experience working as an APD across a number of settings, including clinical practice and corporate health. Please give Chris a warm welcome.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Nicole. Good morning, everybody. I arrived just in time, so I think I was stressing out some of the Diabetes South Australia guys here. Had a delay on the tarmac in Melbourne, so I arrived 5 minutes ago, so very, very lucky. But I'm glad to be here, and great to be talking about food is medicine and focusing on grains and legumes today. And yeah, so I'd welcome questions throughout, and there'll also be questions at question time at the end if you've got some questions or things that I don't cover. But yeah, looking to have an engaging presentation and discussion. So if you've got any questions on the slide that I'm presenting, feel free to put your hand up, and more than happy to take those questions as they come. So first of all, I just thought I'd reflect on the food is medicine theme. And so this theme, it's not new. It's been around for a long time, and an ancient Greek philosopher / doctor or physician once said, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. And so this statement and the food is medicine theme is just as relevant as it is today as it was back then. And in recent years, the focus on food as opposed to nutrients is really coming back into dietary guidelines around the world. And that's what hopefully I'll give you today, an appreciation of focusing on food in your diet as opposed, and obviously keeping an eye on some important nutrients, and we'll go into those. And just on food is medicine as well, my role, sorry I didn't give you a good background for my role. So GLNC is the independent authority on the nutrition and health benefits of grain foods and legumes, and we're based in Sydney. And a part of our kind of mission is to communicate the science around grain foods and legumes and how they can be incorporated into a balanced diet. And so that's what I'll be, I guess, talking about today. And so these foods and I guess all foods can potentially have healthful effects on the body, managing blood glucose levels, providing the nutrition that we need to get throughout every day, as well as protect our health in the long term, and then also the social and cultural aspects of food and just the enjoyment of food that contributes to our well-being. And so I think all of those, I guess, components are really important, so keep those in mind as well. So my goal for today is to, as I've mentioned, educate you on the importance of choosing good quality grain foods and legumes as part of a balanced diet, and really focusing on that balanced diet. So it's not just about grain foods and legumes, it's about your total diet. and that's going to contribute to well-being and also the management of your diabetes or someone that you care for, and also provide you practical tips that will allow you to apply these to your diet, or help someone that you're caring for apply that to theirs. And as an outline for today, I'll be touching on the key recommendations. I'll be touching on the key international kind of best practice recommendations for dietary practices to manage diabetes, as well as then going into what is a balanced diet and how that looks and how you can apply that in your day. Then I'm going to go through what's to gain from grains, educate you on what types of grain foods are out there, what types should we be choosing. Then lifting the lid on legumes, something I really want to focus on, and that's something that GLNC is very passionate about, advocating for legumes in Australians' diets. And then at the end, as I mentioned, providing practical tips and tricks. And so I will be providing tips throughout, but there'll be this end section where I'll really give you some ideas that, and I'll challenge you to choose a few to try and implement in the next few weeks or in the coming months into your diet. So hopefully set some goals there. And then I'll sum up, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. So as I mentioned, starting off with the international best practice guidelines for all people with diabetes, and these are the top line key recommendations in regards to diet. So the number one being retrieve dietary counselling and education from an APD, and I can't stress that enough. And looking at the room in here, I'm not sure how many people have seen a dietitian or have seen a dietitian recently, because the way that we have managed diabetes has transformed in the last years to decades. So I think it's really important to have an ongoing checkup while you're monitoring your blood glucose levels, and having support from a dietitian to help you manage your diet, and then also an educator to help manage your diabetes, because as well as the dietary recommendations transform, you still have the medications and all that. So I think support for diet as well as monitoring and management of your diabetes is really important. Can't stress that enough. The second main point is that just like the general population, we all need to be enjoying a balanced diet. We need to get all the nutrients that our bodies need for health in the short term, and then also protecting your body and protecting your health against diseases or diet-related diseases in the long term. Enjoying that balanced diet is really important, and I'll be going into that. The third point, and this is the same for the general population, is aiming to achieve and maintain a healthy body weight. So eating to your energy needs, and that's, portions and food choices are really important there. And so hopefully today you'll be confident with your grain food choices, and can give you a bit of a guide for portions, but I think using an APD to really personalise your diet and portion sizes is really important, because that's, particularly for individuals with type 1 diabetes. The fourth point, choosing lower glycemic index carbohydrate foods, and that's something that you can certainly lower the overall glycemic index with your diet through your grain food choices, because grain foods are a staple. So we want to be choosing healthier options, and that's one way to lower your glycemic index, which helps with blood glucose management, as well as other health benefits. And then fifth, maintaining consistency in your carbohydrate intake throughout the day. So as I mentioned, they're the international best practice guidelines. And what I wanted to just point out from the top is that grain foods and legumes play a really important role in all four of those kind of top line recommendations. And so I'll be going into these, and hopefully you can apply some of these to your daily diet. So starting off with building a balanced diet. So when you hear, I guess it's a dietitian's mantra, a balance and moderation, and choosing a balanced diet. So I'm interested to know what comes to mind when you hear that term, a balanced diet or balance. What are some of the words that come to mind? Can anybody have some examples? Sorry, what was that? Sorry? Oh, take a guess, yeah. Take a guess. Just what's the first word when you hear the word balance? Variety, a little bit of everything. Sorry, what was that? Food pyramid. Yep. Yeah. So, and I guess each of those responses was I guess touching on that first response, which was about variety and thinking about the different types of food groups that were in the pyramid. So they're great responses, and I guess that's what I think of as well. But what I also think of as a dietitian is the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which were revised in 2013. So this is a huge document. You don't need to know it, and I'm going to I guess pull out the top line things that are important. And it sounds like you've already got some of that knowledge there. On the right, we've got the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, and so this, I'm not even sure if the food pyramid was ever. Yeah, it was never actually a public health initiative. I think it was something non-government organisation. So the dietary guidelines use this kind of plate model, and it's I guess what it represents is the estimated proportion to consume throughout the day for the general population. But within this, it allows for a lot of variety, as we mentioned, variety in food choices. And so it's just a guide for the general population, and it'll be slightly different for everybody, in particular for people with type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes. But what I guess it conveys is that message of variety. So you can see there's the 5 food groups, then we've got some foods down in the bottom right corner, and then we've got some fats on the bottom left corner. So that's something which you might have seen before, you might have not, but this is what I guess is the government-supported NHMRC equivalent to what used to be the food pyramid. But this, so that's the Australian Dietary Guide, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. And then, as I mentioned, the Australian Dietary Guidelines were revised last year. And so these guidelines are based on a comprehensive review of the scientific evidence of how foods relate to health. So they're based on over 55,000 studies. And that's, so 55,000 studies on the relationship of food to health goes into developing these guidelines, and then we get the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which represents how those foods can be incorporated into healthy diets. And again, just touching on the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating allows for lots of different cultural styles of diets, lots of different types of healthy diets, like whether it's Mediterranean or an Asian style, or even vegetarian or mix of vegetarian, those different types of vegetarian diets as well. They provide recommendations on whole foods, so they don't talk about carbohydrates specifically, or fat, or proteins. They talk about foods that contain those nutrients, because that's where those health benefits are coming from, the whole foods. And then an interesting quote that comes out of the dietary guidelines is that no single food can provide all of the nutrients in the amounts that we need for good health. And so that's so welcome to the Australian Dietary Guidelines if you've never met them.
I've got a question.
Yep.
What do you mean whole foods?
Good question. So whole foods, basically within the circle, they're all foods that are recommended as part of the dietary guidelines. So basically when I'm talking about whole foods, I'm not just referring to foods like an apple where it's the whole food in itself. I'm referring to all of the foods that are recommended as part of those dietary guidelines. And really that's about differentiating recommendations. If you hear, you may hear in the news sometimes people just talking about fat or protein or carbohydrate or vitamin A. That's what I'm talking about. We're talking about foods like grain foods or vegetables or fruits, as opposed to just those single nutrients. So within the Australian Dietary Guidelines, there's, I guess, the three top line key messages that come out of the guidelines. Number one is to be physically active and eat to your energy needs, and that relates straight back to the same guideline which was in the International Best Practice for Management of Diabetes, and also relates to this food and exercise is medicine theme of today. The second guideline is to enjoy a variety of nutritious foods from these 5 food groups. And so again, it's that variety message coming through. And just to give you an example of why the variety of, choosing a variety of food groups each day, and even choosing a variety within those food groups, an example of that is, so your vegetables, for example, they contain protective dietary fibres. They also provide essential vitamins and minerals. And then the different colours in that group are also an indication that those foods have nutrients that are protective. So they might not be essential to our health, but what they do is protect our health in the long term. So I would still say they are essential, but they're not considered they're not considered like iodine, where if you don't have it, it will result in a deficiency. These phytonutrients are things like antioxidants, and they help to protect health in the long term. And the different colours in that food group are representative of different types of phytonutrients which protect health. So in your vegetable food group, choosing variety is a great choice, because you're getting a variety of those protective nutrients as well as those essential nutrients and fibres in that group. Fruit's very similar, so it contains those phytonutrients, vitamins, minerals, and also carbohydrates, as you may be aware. Your dairy or dairy alternatives are your source of calcium, but they're also providing protein and low glycemic index carbohydrates, and I'll go into that if that's something that you're not quite familiar with. Then your meat and meat alternatives are providing essential minerals like iron and zinc and vitamin B12, as well as amino acids and so proteins, which help to build muscles and support your immune system as well. And then your grain foods are primary contributors of 7 key nutrients in the diet. They provide a range of dietary fibres. So you may have heard of dietary fibre before, but there's actually lots of different dietary fibres. And that's why choosing a variety of grain foods, vegetables, fruits is really important, because that helps to feed the good bugs in your gut. If you've ever heard of probiotics, they kind of act in a similar way to promote health in the long term, as well as digestive health as well. And so that's, I guess, hopefully giving you an image of why choosing a variety of foods in each of the food groups is really important. So the third guideline is to limit discretionary foods. So you may not have heard of the word discretionary before, and basically what it refers to is the group of foods that are in that bottom right-hand corner. These foods are higher in saturated fats, higher in added sugars, and higher in sodium or salt. And so these foods have been shown to affect our health in a negative way. And what's something to point out is a recent survey of Australians' food intakes found that 30% of Australians, as a total, two and older, 30% of their energy every day was coming from those discretionary foods. And that's really concerning, because if you're trying to achieve the first guideline, it makes it very difficult. And also, if you're trying to ensure a balanced diet and get all of those nutrients, consuming a large proportion of those foods in the bottom corner is going to influence that, because those foods are nutrient poor but energy dense. And so that's why it's so important to base your diet around the 5 food groups, and with the discretionary foods to limit them. And when you do choose to include them, because they can be included in an overall balanced diet, but when you do choose to include them in small amounts and only not often, so infrequently. Okay, so now that we've gone through the food groups, I just wanted to get an idea of, so we've got the 5 food groups. How many of those food groups, actually first of all, is everyone familiar with what carbohydrates are? Yep. So we know that carbohydrates influence our blood glucose levels. So I just wanted to check because I could expand on that. Out of the 5 food groups, how many of those food groups contain carbohydrate foods? So all of them. And that's right. I'm not sure if you saw that in the legumes group, in the meat and meat alternatives group, we have legumes, and they are a source of carbohydrate. In dairy, you're getting low glycemic index carbohydrates in your milks and yogurts. So then you get fruit, and then you've got starchy vegetables, and then obviously your grains as well. So we've actually got carbohydrates in all of the food groups. And so choosing, we know that, so basically that's telling us that all of these foods that are recommended as part of a balanced diet are providing important nutrition. And then so for people, for individuals with diabetes, type 1 diabetes in particular, choosing good quality carbohydrates in appropriate proportions is really important. And so choosing good quality grain foods and legumes is very important as well. And we know that it's the amount that you consume, the type that you consume. And type refers to glycemic index, maybe the fibres that are in there as well. the timing throughout the day that you consume it, and then your body's ability to control that. So in this case, talking about physical activity or what kind of medication you're taking, and insulin as well. So this is what, I guess, so with the red, if you're not getting the amount, the type, the timing, and your lifestyle matched to your diet, your blood glucose levels aren't going to be, that stable profile that we want to see. And so hopefully we want to get to the tick with, and including grain foods and legumes, making healthy choices there as well. Today I'll be focusing, I will touch briefly on amount, but again, really that's using resources like accredited practicing dietitians and credentialed diabetes educators as support to get the amounts and the individualised dietary recommendations down. Today I'll be really focusing on the types of grain foods and legumes that are available and that are good choices, and then also just touch on timing as well. So this section, I'm going to go into what's to gain from grains. So how are grain foods medicine? So in the recent survey that I mentioned, grain foods were the leading contributors of 7 essential nutrients in Australians' diet, including those protective dietary fibres, folate and thiamine. So they're B group vitamins, and they're important to unlock energy and for, I guess, day-to-day well-being as well as in the long term. Iron, which is important for oxygen transport around the body, magnesium and iodine, 2 essential minerals, and then also carbohydrates, which are, that primary fuel for your brain and your working muscles, but that's also something that influences blood glucose levels. So these are essential nutrients that the grain foods group are the number 1 contributor in Australians' diets. And that doesn't, so there's other nutrients that this food group is providing, but not in the, I guess, proportion of other food groups. And this doesn't take into account those phytonutrients I mentioned, so those protective nutrients that are within certain types of grain foods. So they're providing essential nutrition in our day. In terms of how they act as medicines, enjoying a variety of grain foods, choosing mostly whole grain and high fibre, and I'll go into that, is linked with a range of health benefits, including improved blood glucose control, lowering your risk of heart disease, and that can be through lowering blood pressure or lowering cholesterol, lowering your risk of bowel cancer, which is Australia's 2nd biggest cancer killer, and reducing your risk of weight gain in the long term. So with grain foods, choosing mostly whole grain or high fibre has these health benefits. In addition, grain foods can help to promote your health in the long term by helping you to lower the overall GI of your diet. And this has been proven to improve blood glucose management as well, reduce the risk of complications of diabetes in the long term, also help to prevent overweight and weight gain in the long term, and also promote heart health and reduce your risk of cancers as well, some cancers. So choosing lower GI grain foods in preference of higher GI grain foods is one way to help to lower the overall GI of your diet. And so I'll give you some tips and hints on how to do that. But if you are in the supermarket looking and comparing, you can look for the low GI symbol. So that's on foods that are certified as a low GI option. Pasta. So when we have the whole grains, these can then be chopped up very finely into a flour. And so that's when you get wholemeal flour, and generally you'll see it as wheat, but you can get a wholemeal flour from any of these grains. And then that wholemeal flour can be used to make a wide range of products. And these are products that humans have been making for thousands of years, things like breads, so different varieties of breads, and pasta as well. So you can have a whole grain flour so you can have a whole grain pasta if the flour that is being used contains the whole grain. So if it's a wholemeal flour. So does that make sense? So, and it's the same with bread. So you can have whole grain breads, That's when you're using all of the parts of the whole grain that's been chopped up into that flour. And then on the flip side, you can have refined grain products where, so for example, with white bread, the bran layer and then also the germ, so there's three main parts of a whole grain. The bran layer and the germ are removed, and then you keep the third part, which is called the endosperm, and then using that to make a white bread that doesn't contain all of the parts of the whole grain, so it's not considered a whole grain food. So hopefully that gives you some idea, and hopefully that answers your question around the pasta. So polenta is with corn, and so polenta is polenta doesn't use the whole grain generally, but you probably can get a wholemeal polenta, if that makes sense. So it's made based on corn. So now we've got an idea of what grains are, and I mentioned that those grains can be processed into grain foods that we've been making for a very long time and consuming as part of balanced diets and healthy diets for a very long time. So things like breads. You can have brown rice, which is a whole grain, and then you can have white rice, which is not a whole grain because you've got the outer brown layer removed. But then you can have a whole different variety of breads. Then breakfast cereals are there as well, and then things like couscous, but you can have whole grain couscous as well. And then your intact grains, things like rolled oats, quinoa, and then polentas there as well, as you mentioned, and pastas. So just keeping in mind here that discretionary foods aren't here, and so we should be really basing our grain food choices around the grain food groups as in the first instance. So next I wanted to go on to then the next step, because earlier I mentioned that the health benefits are associated with choosing whole grain and high fibre, and there's also health benefits in choosing lower GI to lower the overall GI of your diet. So the first step for most Australians is to choose core grain foods, so foods that are recommended as part of the dietary guidelines more often, because we know that 30% of people's energy is coming from discretionary choices. So the first step is for them to choose these foods that are recommended as part of the dietary guidelines, and then we should be choosing mostly whole grain and mostly high fibre. And then, even for the added benefit, where we can, choose lower GI options. And so on the right, I'm trying to visually show that how we can make healthier grain food choices. And so this diagram shows that not all whole grain foods are necessarily high in fibre. Not all high in fibre foods are necessarily whole grain or low GI. And not all low GI foods are whole grain or high in fibre, if that makes sense. But there is this sweet spot in the middle. And I like to think of it as the holy trinity of choosing grain choices. And that's when you can choose choices that are whole grain, high fibre, and low GI. And that's what I'll be giving you some examples of what are those types of foods. And they're the kinds of choices that you should be choosing most of the time to help you get those benefits, the benefits of choosing whole grain, high fibre, as well as the benefits of lowering the GI of your diet. So first of all, just focusing on whole grain and high fibre choices. So on the right I've got a list and then I've got some pictures, and down the bottom here that's whole grain pasta. So it might not seem as dark as you might have expected it to be, but that's whole grain pasta in the bottom left corner. So we've got intact or cracked grains or pseudo grains, things like oats or rolled oats, quinoa, rye, buckwheat, bulgur, so we've touched on those. Brown rice is a whole grain as well. Wholemeal breads and multi-grain breads. Whole grain breakfast cereals like wheat biscuits, more flaked whole grain cereals. Whole grain crisp breads as well. Wholemeal pasta and wholemeal couscous. And wholemeal just means that the entire whole grain has been used to make the flour. So hopefully that's not confusing. Wholemeal actually means whole grain. And then also bran-based cereals, so they're high in fibre as well. So all of these choices are whole grain and or high in fibre. So now what about low GI? So on the right, if we focus on the right here first, these are low GI foods that aren't whole grain. Things like white pasta, traditional white sourdoughs, so they're low GI, but they're they're using the white flour, not the wholemeal flour. Certain noodles like Hokkien, udon, and rice vermicelli are low GI as well. And you can also get low GI white rices, but not all rices are low GI, but you can get low GI varieties. So with low GI products, you can look for the GI symbol as well. And then on the right, we have foods that are whole grain, high fibre, and low GI. So these foods, I guess, tick all the boxes. If you're choosing intact grains, or pseudo grains and cooking them and adding them to a salad or adding them to soups, they're lower GI options because they're tightly packed within that whole grain. They're going to be slowly released into the carbohydrate that's within those grains is going to be slowly released into your body. Some wholemeal and multi-grain breads as well. So breads is a there should be an asterisk there. So breads looking for the low GI symbol or choosing a brand where you know that it's a low GI, because not all wholemeal breads or multi-grain breads will be low GI. Wholemeal traditional sourdoughs are low GI and getting the whole grain and high fibre. Choosing breakfast cereals or breakfast options that are based around barley or oats, and then also wholemeal pasta has a lower GI. So we've learned about what grains are, how they can act as a medicine in your diet. So what are the grain food recommendations? So the first, and I've touched on this, enjoying a variety. So choosing a variety of these grain foods, you're going to get different nutrients. In particular, you're going to get those different phytonutrients which are going to protect your health in the long term, particularly when you're choosing whole grain or high fibre options. As a next step, aim to lower the overall GI of your diet by replacing high GI foods with lower GI food options. And a tip to do this is to aim to include at least one low GI carbohydrate food at each meal and base your snacks around low GI foods. And what I mean by this, I guess the first point of that tip is, with the image on your right, you've got wheat bix or wheat breakfast biscuits. And so they're a high GI, whole grain and high fibre grain food. So they're a healthier choice, but they're high GI. In that meal, you've also got banana and some milk, which are both low GI. So in that meal, you're balancing the glycemic index of that meal. You're bringing it down by choosing at least one low GI, where you're including a higher GI food. So that's one way that's one way how a meal can help to lower the overall GI of your choices. And that's so this is an example of a breakfast meal. But you can do that with every meal, and that's where if it is dinner and your usual choice is a high GI option. So for example, white rice, you could potentially add lentils with your rice and cook them together. If you weren't willing to compromise on the rice, or choose a low GI white rice. This is just one example. How if you had a high GI and a low GI option, you're going to balance it out a bit. But I guess the optimal choice there would be to choose a low GI brown rice and also potentially include some legumes, which we'll get into later in the presentation. So does that help there? And then also maintaining consistency in the amounts that you're consuming and the regularity of your meals throughout the day. So just a word on portions, and I've said it a few times, but the amounts of grain foods and legumes that you're consuming at meals and snacks should really be guided on an individual basis, because it's going to be different for everybody. And it's going to be different based on your lifestyle, your physical activity levels, your medication, as well as how you're tracking with your blood glucose monitoring. Portions are really important in aiming to eat towards your energy needs. So if your goal is to achieve or maintain a healthy weight, watching your portions and being mindful of how much you're consuming is really important as well. And then as a guide, I've just included what one exchange or around 15 grams of carbohydrate is for a range of grain foods and legumes as well. And so I won't go into that in too much detail, but these resources are available, and I'm sure, particularly with this group, you've got some understanding about carbohydrate counting. And if you're looking for more support, then seeking the guidance of an educator is really important to be able to understand how much carbohydrate is in different foods. Okay, great. So now we're on to lifting the lid on legumes. So does everyone know what legumes are? No? That's fair enough. We recently did a survey. We did a survey of Australians, and 75% of Australians said that they knew what the legumes food group was. So that was great. I mean, that was great in terms of GL&C. We thought it might be a little bit lower. But then we gave them a list of a range of grain foods and legumes and fruits and vegetables, and the amount that were consistently picking the legumes was slightly lower. So it's not uncommon for people. It's not uncommon for people to not know what legumes are, and also not be able to identify the range of choices that are out there. So hopefully today you'll learn what legumes are and how you can easily include them in your diet. So with the Australian Dietary Guidelines review, they stated that for Australians to meet what would be a recommended level of legume consumption, they'd have to increase their legume consumption by 470%, which is a huge amount. And basically what that tells us is that not many Australians are consuming legumes. And the average is actually, on average, Australians are consuming less than 1.5 serves, with one serve being half a cup of cooked legumes, like beans. So less than 1.5 serve each week. But the reality is that most people aren't even consuming them. The people that do consume them are consuming a lot more than everyone. So there's something. They're a food group that certainly are superfoods, and in fact, Professor Jenny Brand Miller, and she was one of the. You may have heard of her. She's written a few books on glycemic index. She was one of the, founders of the glycemic index, publishing the first few studies around glycemic index. She's been quoted as saying, legumes are the star food for blood glucose management. So that's why they're so important, particularly for managing your blood glucose levels. So we've got some understanding of legumes, but some people might be learning a lot more today. Did anybody have legumes for breakfast? No? Did anybody have legumes for breakfast? Did you? Okay. Well, this week? Has anybody had baked beans this week? Okay, so you may not know about legumes, but you've actually eaten legumes. Baked beans are legumes. So legumes are also known as pulses, which is a little bit confusing as well. So pulses are the same things as legumes. We're talking about the same food group. And I've mentioned that we find them in the vegetables group because they're high in those protective dietary fibres. They deliver a range of essential vitamins and minerals, just like other vegetables. And those protective components, you can see they're different colours, so they've got those different phytonutrients or antioxidants as well. And then they're also high in protein, which is really unique, for, vegetables. And that's how they're also classified as a meat and a meat alternative. So they're really, a versatile food and a unique food for a vegetable as well. They include all types of beans, peas, so things like split peas, lentils, chickpeas, and they come in a different varieties, so you can purchase them at the supermarket as dried, or you can get them cooked in a can, and you can also get them frozen as well. Actually, sorry, just on that as well. So when I'm talking about serves, I'm talking about the dietary guideline serves, which may be different to how you've learnt how to count carbohydrates. So just keep that in mind as well. So and then there's other foods that contain legumes as well. And we might be consuming these foods without even knowing that we're getting some legumes in there as well. So things like baked beans, tofu, legume dips like hummus, legume meat alternatives, things like falafel, or you can get like legume burger patties or legume sausages as well. Dairy alternatives like soy milk or soy cheeses or soy yogurts, and you can get whole bean soy milk as well. And then legumes are also found in a wide range of soups. So whether if you're making it yourself and not adding legumes, you can easily add them, but they're also found in soups if you're buying soups from the supermarket that are canned, or frozen ready-made meals and things like that as well. And also traditional dishes, so lots of Mediterranean, lots of Asian dishes use legumes in their dishes, so, and curries and things like that. So now looking at legumes as medicine. So just like that whole grain, legumes contain, they're a seed as well, so they contain all of those nutrients. And actually, interestingly, one food which I didn't have on the previous slide was sprouts. Has anybody ever seen those sprouts in the supermarket? No. So well, generally the ones that I've seen, that's a mung bean that's been sprouted. So they've put it in water and it had started to grow as a plant, and then it's ready to eat. So that's actually a mung bean as well. So that's a legume food too. So legumes are nutrient rich. So they contain those protective dietary fibres, protein, which is unique, carbohydrates, and most legumes are lower GI carbohydrate as well. They contain a range of phytonutrients. There's antioxidants that are going to protect your health in the long term. Similar to grains, they've got some B group vitamins like your folate and thiamine, and niacin as well. And then minerals such as iron and zinc. So they're higher in iron than grains, and they contain zinc and magnesium, two essential minerals as well. Enjoying legumes more often is linked to a range of health benefits, including blood glucose management, as I've mentioned, they're star performers there, improved weight management, improved cholesterol levels, lower risk of heart disease, and similar to grains, reduced risk of some cancers as well. What's interesting with legumes is because so few people in Australia consume them, the evidence on consumption and health benefits is mostly limited to trials where people have, or other countries that consume legumes in a greater proportion. So that's where that's a bit of a science side point. That's interesting as well, because so few people consume them. So few people are getting these health benefits in their diet. And the last point, longevity. So with longevity, I mean reduced risk of an early death. And so that's where there's been an association with higher legume intakes and longer lives. And that's, it's really highlighted by when you look at the countries that have the highest life expectancy, and it's not just down to legumes, it's just an association. But these countries that have the highest life expectancy also consume lots of legumes and plant foods in their diet. So cultures like the Japanese, they've got the highest life expectancy, and they've got one of the highest legume intakes mainly through soybeans and through things like miso and tofu and other products like that. And then also the Mediterranean diet. You may have been hearing that the Mediterranean diet is promoted, or a Mediterranean style of diet is promoted as one of the healthiest dietary patterns in the world, and that's they also include lots of legumes in their dishes, whether it's things like falafel or in salads, in kind of casserole type dishes, or minestrone soup, or hummus dips and things like that. So legumes, and with legumes, I really encourage people to start a healthy habit, because so few people consume them, or know they're consuming them, or know how to consume them. Starting a healthy habit with legumes is really easy. And as a starting goal, I challenge you to aim to eat legumes at least 2 to 3 times each week. So we're not talking about actual amounts here, we're just talking about times, and that's a good way to start. So just aim to include some of those foods in some amount at least 2 to 3 times a week. And if you're achieving that, then great, then you can step up your goal. And if you're looking for an aspirational goal, the science tells us that from trials that half a cup of cooked legumes, which is around 75 grams of cooked legumes, whether that any of those kind of legumes foods that I just went through on the previous page, half a cup of those a day significantly improves blood glucose management. So that's, if you're looking for a kind of a top level goal, then that's some inspiration. And an interesting quote from Dr. Alison Coates at the University of South Australia. They were recently doing a study, and that was for 8 weeks they had to consume half a cup of legumes each day. And the participants in the research had commented on how easy it was to incorporate that half a cup of legumes each day. And so that's a lot more than what people are consuming at the moment. But once you build that habit of consuming legumes more often, it's easy, because it's adding something. It's not, a lot of diet type advice you might hear in the media and stuff, it's like, cut this out, get rid of that. But this is a positive thing you can include, and it's gonna be beneficial for your health. Okay, so now getting on to the practical tips and tricks. And as I mentioned at the start, I'd really like to, challenge you all here today to choose 2 or 3 that you think are, quick wins for your diet that you can achieve in the next, 2 weeks to a month. So, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to try that at least once, and then build, and hopefully you'll be making healthier grain food and legume choices. So with grain food, so what I've done here is to really kind of emphasise that point of choosing whole grain, high fibre, and where you can lower GI foods, and balancing out your meals. Provided, different options, different grain food options for breakfast, lunch, snacks, and dinner as well. So as I mentioned, choosing breakfast options based around oats, traditional oats or barley, or high bran cereals. So they're things like porridge with oats, and traditional oats are best. They're the lower GI ones. As opposed to, you can get quick oats where it's really finely chopped, and some of those products aren't low GI. So just be careful there. So choosing, your rolled oats, definitely low GI, or things like Barley Max, you can get that as a rolled product. And choosing high bran cereals, things like all bran, or those options. And then muesli as well. There's lots of muesli options as well. They're low GI, but just being mindful of your amounts as well. And then in addition, as I mentioned, if your regular grain food choice isn't a low GI food, you can balance it out by choosing things like baked beans at breakfast, making sure there's some sort of dairy, whether it's milk or yogurt, and or fresh fruit at your breakfast, and that's going to balance that breakfast out. Down the bottom, I've got these ones below the line, they're higher GI options, but as I mentioned, they can be included as part of a balanced diet. So Wheat Bix and things like whole grain flake cereals as well. Generally, they're higher GI. And if you're not sure about the GI, remember, you can look for the low GI symbol. And if you can look for the low GI symbol if you've got any resources that you can check against. And then as a last resort, if you're unsure of if your favourite brand is low GI or high GI, you can contact the manufacturer, and they're generally very fast to respond to you. Lunchtime and snacks, so traditional sourdoughs, whether that's, ideally it's a whole grain sourdough there. Choosing dense whole grain breads, things like dark rye breads. So I know Bergen's got a range of those dark rye breads that are low GI. And certain multigrain breads as well. Low GI brown rice options, you can have that in a salad or as a side with your lunch. Then things like choosing fruit loaf bread, and you can actually get a wholemeal fruit loaf bread as well now. Plain popcorn or rye-based crisp breads, they're low GI. And then other kind of snack options there that are whole grain and high fibre but high GI, other whole grains, so like wheat-based crisp breads and wheat-based crackers, and then also wholemeal English muffins, wholemeal breads, rice, and rice cakes. Those rice cakes that you can buy in the supermarket. They're basically, generally they're all made from just 100% brown rice, so they're whole grain but they're high GI. So if you are consuming those, make sure you're balancing that meal out with some lower GI or just a balanced meal to lower the overall GI of that meal. So for dinner, as I've mentioned, intact whole grains, they're great as a side dish, great in a salad or a soup or a casserole. And so just choosing your kind of favourite or your preferred option there, or trying something different. And GLNC has a wide range of recipes that incorporate some of these different grains. So you can have a go with trying those and getting adventurous with those. For dinner, choosing a wholemeal pasta, but also any white pasta, if it's cooked al dente, it's low GI as well. And then some Asian noodles, while they're not whole grain, they are lower GI. And then also just noting that whole grain couscous is a high GI option, and so is couscous. So some easy ways to replace high with low is to just make a straight swap for a low GI option. So if you're having bacon and eggs with white bread in the morning, the first step could be to change that white bread to a low GI white bread or a low GI traditional sourdough. And even better, choosing a whole grain bread that's low GI. So it's high fibre, whole grain and low GI there. And then the next step, if you're really trying to get a healthy breakfast in first thing in the morning, is to choose an option that's a healthier choice there. So the bacon being a discretionary choice because it's higher in sodium and saturated fats. So So, choosing baked beans instead, or just having the eggs with a slice of toast and a piece of fruit or some dairy there as well. Instead of a cake muffin, or a cake or a muffin, choosing one slice of raisin toast with a thin scrape of a spread. Instead of corn chips with a salsa, choosing a rye-based crisp bread, or like vegetable sticks with a dip made from legumes. Instead of potato chips, choosing whole grain plain popcorn and just lightly maybe some olive oil or something. That's a low GI choice as well, and it's whole grain as well. Instead of choosing fruit or soft drink, choosing the whole fruit or yogurt, or even making some sort of a smoothie and adding some rolled oats in there to get some more fibre in there, and that's going to fill you up as well. So there's some healthy swaps. And the GLNC has lots of fact sheets that kind of expand on these types of options. If you're looking for something that, maybe your kind of favourite treat isn't on that you can maybe a couple of times a week swap it out for something healthier. We've got, a list of these in our fact sheets. As I mentioned, we've also got a wide range of recipes, and so this is just one example on the right on your right as well, that includes those different types of whole grains. So if you haven't tried quinoa, and you feel like trying or feel like impressing your friends at a summer salad, that has a mixture of quinoa and wheat berries, which are pretty much just whole grain wheat. So we've got a variety of these types of recipes, and then also on the left, there's just a simple option. So this is just like a real brief snapshot of the different types of recipes that are on the GLNC website. So now getting into the legumes and how you can start that healthy habit with legumes. So as I mentioned, it's so easy, and people that have done that over a short period and established that habit are commenting that it is an easy habit to establish, and it's a habit that's definitely going to pay off for your health. So maybe more of a summer option, but if you're still having salads at the moment, just having a bean mix. So whether it's starting off with a small 75-gram can, you can get those small cans, having that in your cupboard or on you at work, and just adding that to your salad, or it could be even soups and things as well. That's such an easy way to just boost the legume content as well as the protein content. So it's even balancing that salad out. So you could, you're bolstering that salad up as well. So here's a really easy kind of recipe for salads. But just with using the canned legume options, I just want to point out that when you use them, be sure to drain them, and then drain then rinse, because those options are slightly higher in sodium. So that helps to reduce the sodium by, I think, a study on them showed that it reduced it by up to 40%. So it's a significant way to decrease the salt, and it also gets rid of some of the components that are on the outside of the beans, which can contribute to the age-old thought that beans can give you flatulence. So by draining them, you're kind of getting rid of some of those components as well as reducing the sodium. And just on that point as well, that idea that legumes increase your gas, that's, first of all, I guess it's a sign. It's a healthy sign. It's a healthy sign of a healthy digestive system. But also, with regular consumption, if you're establishing that pattern, your body will adjust. So with anything, introduce only small amounts to begin with. But once you establish that pattern, studies with legumes have shown that people don't report those feelings or extra gas once you've established that pattern in the long term. So start small and give it some time, and once you've established that, your body will adapt to that. So also an easy way to establish a healthy habit, or you could, if you're up to making your own legumes dip, we've got recipes on our website. And so hummus is an easy one. So if you're up to making it, you can make a batch at the start of the week, then keep it in the fridge and just take more portions with you to work, or snack on that as your snack. And you could also, there's such a wide range of hummus dips at the supermarket as well. And then we've also got a mung bean dip there, so it's made very similar to hummus dip. But yeah, you can get adventurous with legumes too, and impress your friends with legumes as well. So just think about which ones do you want to kind of keep in the back of your mind and try out, and just ways to start this healthy habit. So designing an international dish. As I mentioned, lots of international dishes traditionally have legumes as one of the core ingredients. But what you might see when you walk down the international food section is some of the foods that are on the shelves are omitting the legumes where they used to be. And so that's where, if you're making some sort of Mexican dish or some sort of Middle Eastern or Mediterranean dish, thinking about legumes, because the legumes as a traditional component of that dish aren't always translating into what the recipes that we're seeing or what the options that we're seeing in our supermarket. Then also some ideas to give legumes a go is to use baked beans and choosing salt reduced where you can in a meal. But you can also use baked beans to make things like falafel. If you haven't tried that before, that's an option to mix up your protein source at your meals, or to complement a protein source. So you could have falafel with with a kind of mince or something like that. Warm up with choosing canned soup that contains legumes. So minestrone soups generally have legumes in there. That's a good time of year for that option. Choosing soy drink. Giving soy drink a go for a week and choosing the whole bean version. You're going to be getting the whole legume in that soy milk, and then also as an option choosing tofu in a stir fry or a salad. They're all, ideas to start this healthy habit. This is probably my favourite one. Just adding legumes to your favourite dish, because it's so easy. I mean, a study last year found that spaghetti bolognese was, I think it was a part of over 70% of Australians who are the primary kind of cook in the household. Spaghetti bolognese was the number one, recipe as part of their repertoire. And spaghetti bolognese is ideal to add legumes in, whether it's red lentils, and there's a recipe on one of the fact sheets that's available just in that room over there. But it could also be like red kidney beans, or if you're making a different type, you could add any types of beans, and that's going to make your mince go further as well. And legumes are cheap as well, so it's good for the bottom line. So you can do that with your favourite meal and such a wide variety of meals. And we have a resource which I'll point out at the end, which is a guide to how you can easily incorporate convenient, mostly canned options, because they are convenient, into your daily diet. So now just summing up the recommendations for how grains and legumes can act as a medicine in your diet. The key points for building a balanced diet and managing your blood glucose levels are to enjoy a variety of grain foods, choosing mostly whole grain or high fibre grain foods each day. Lowering the overall GI of your diet by replacing high GI grain foods with those lower GI grain foods. So you can do that with grain foods, but then just simply including legumes in your diet is going to lower the overall GI of your diet as well. And then finally, aiming to enjoy, if you're not currently enjoying legumes 2 to 3 times a week, just setting that as a goal for the next few weeks. And remember, we're just talking about times, and then you can build up to amounts and how much you want to include in your diet. But the health benefits with legumes are seen with the higher consumptions. So, including them 2 to 3 times a week, you will get that'll boost the nutrition content of your diet. But then to get the health benefits, you really need to be including them 3 or 4 times, and then trying to include slightly larger amounts as you go. As I mentioned, that half a cup a day is that aspirational goal, if you ever get it. And then also seeking guidance from an APD for individualised dietary advice, particularly around those amounts and the combinations of foods that you're consuming, if you have any questions with those. So as I mentioned, there's additional resources on our website. I'm sure Diabetes South Australia has a range of resources that you're probably already accessing. But some key ones that I wanted to point out for you is up the top left, it's a Cooking with Legumes cookbook. And unfortunately, because it was so popular, we've run out of hard copies. So we don't have any hard copies, but it is available on our website. That's great. Like, it's got just that, like, spaghetti bolognese with red lentils recipe. It's got how you can make kind of healthy burger patties with legumes using legumes as well. So that guide to healthy eating, you can get a fridge magnet as well. So if you, they've got lots of resources, the Australian, I think it's called, actually, it's www.eatforhealth.com.au. So www.eatforhealth.com.au, and that's where you can get that Australian dietary guideline. So the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which was the picture of the food groups that I had up initially. And you can order a fridge magnet. So we have one of those at work, and just because we work in a big building with like lots of different organisations, and we stuck the fridge magnet on the fridge, and yeah, everyone kind of, we always get comments about it, just like, oh, what is this? And that's good. But yeah, so the Eat for Health website has a lot of resources and more information on the guidelines, and that's really about ensuring that balanced diet and choosing that variety. And then also, as I mentioned, recipes, and if you're interested in glycemic index or more information on that, you can go to the GI Foundation or the GI Symbol website. And they also have a database, so if you're interested in identifying whether a food that you eat is a low GI food, you can use their database to find out the glycemic index of that food. So I guess in finishing up before questions, my contact details are there if you want to get in touch with me if you have any questions. And also if you're interested in following us, if you have a Facebook account, I'd recommend following us on Facebook, because we regularly put up healthy recipes or tips and tricks similar to what I presented today. And so that's, I guess, one way to stay connected with us, but also to get a guide on what's happening with new grains and new recipes and things like that.
Would everybody like to join me in thanking Chris for that fantastic presentation? Now, before we break for morning tea, does anybody have any questions for Chris? Oh, yeah, there you go. If you want to just use your loud voice, we don't have a roving mic today, so.
Chris, I make my bread because I want a really low salt diet. How do you add grains to the bread? Do you need to pre-salt them?
That's a good question. I haven't made bread myself, but I work within an organisation called Grain Girls, and they've got a test bakery there, so I can certainly help with your question, but I'll probably have to get back to you on that. But yeah, we've got a couple of bakers that work very closely in our building, so I can get back to that. So if you've got my details, we can get in touch. Yeah.
Chris, you keep talking about legumes in tins.
Yep.
I had this belief that it was always better to have it fresh rather than... So I'm guessing now in a tin is perfect. It's not better to go fresh and make your own, soften it overnight.
I would. We always recommend going the fresh option or the dried. But in terms of, there might be some belief out there that it's unhealthy or that it's not safe or that there's added things in there. But I guess the bottom line is that the legumes themselves are going to be giving the health benefits. So if you're having it from dried or canned, you're still getting those benefits. And I guess where I've probably emphasised canned more is because so many Australians aren't consuming them. That's where the convenience comes in. But the people that do consume legumes in higher intakes are generally preparing them from dried as well, and so that's great if you're doing that and you're prepared to do that. So I'd say yes, if you've got the time and you're familiar with those cooking practices, and you're confident in doing those cooking practices, then certainly go for the dried. But what we found in our most recent survey is that people that are consumers of legumes, around 60% of them do a combination of both. So it's just really what fits with your lifestyle. And how confident you are in the kitchen, and but I'd say hopefully I can let you know that canned isn't bad. You're still going to get those health benefits of legumes, and if you're draining it and rinsing it, you're lowering the sodium levels as well.
Okay, so it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker for today, Dr. Parind Vora. Parind is a fellow at the Royal Australian College of Physicians. He's completed dual fellowships in endocrinology and general and acute care medicine. He undertook his specialist training at the Royal Adelaide, Hobart, North Shore Hospitals, Flinders Medical Centre and Repatriation General Hospital. Parind has a special interest in diabetes, thyroid disease and osteoporosis, and currently he holds a staff specialist position as an endocrinologist and general physician at the Lal McEwen Hospital. Parind also has completed higher studies and holds a master's degree in public health from the University of Western Sydney and has a great interest in epidemiology and preventative medicine. He also enjoys golf and badminton and has a keen interest in current world affairs. Please put your hands together and welcome Parind.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Nicola. So I was asked to come and speak about the type 1 diabetes and consideration around exercise. And I had to say that I told Karen that this morning I had to do a bit of pumping session before I came to talk to you, all of you. So my topic today is pumping iron with sugar, consideration of exercise with type 1 diabetes. Does anyone recognize any of these celebrities on the right side? The guy on the topmost? That's Arnie in the middle, yeah. How about the right top? So that's Gary Hall. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 1999, and he won the Olympic gold medal in Sydney Olympics for 50-meter freestyle. The guy below him? That's Sam Reid. He used to play for Port, and now he plays for GWS. The guy below him? The rugby player, Rod Kiefer. He used to play rugby union in late 90s, early 2000s. And the guy below him. Anyone recognize this? No? So that's Wasim Akram, who was the Pakistani Test cricket player, one of the finest cricket bowlers, and he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 94. So these are all the elite athletes with type 1 diabetes, and they all have done their elite sports while having type 1 diabetes. So there is nothing that stops you doing exercise with type 1 diabetes, okay? What I'm going to talk about is insulin and glucose, how they work together, some basics of exercise physiology in type 1 diabetes, rules of exercise in type 1 diabetes, and I came up with these rules this week, and I'm very proud of them. Some of the practical points with subcutaneous insulin or insulin pump, and exercise with complication of type 1 diabetes. And before we begin, there are some random things I wanted to tell you. So pancreas is a organ of interest today. So pancreas is a small organ, 100 grams of weight, which sits behind the stomach, inside the abdomen. Weighs only 100 grams, just like a cup full of water. And if you think about the cells we're interested in, so this is the pancreatic islet, and pancreatic islet is a very small part of pancreas. It weighs about 1 gram, like a pinch of salt. And that's what's responsible for making a variety of hormones, including insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin. So that pinch of salt is what causes all these issues, okay? I also wanted to talk about insulin, which is an anabolic hormone, and some counter-regulatory hormones. And I'll be talking about this terminology throughout the talk. So just to explain to you what anabolic and what catabolic hormones are, anabolic hormone is something that builds things. So it takes small things and makes big things. So it takes glucose and makes glycogen. It takes free fatty acid and makes big fat cell. It takes amino acid and makes protein. And counter-regulatory hormones, the catabolic hormones, does exactly the opposite thing. So it breaks down the big things. So from glycogen, it makes glucose. From big fat cell or triglyceride, it makes free fatty acid. And from big protein molecule, it makes amino acids. Okay? They work against each other. If one's working, the second doesn't work. If the second's working, the first doesn't work. Make sense? All right, so what happens in normal physiology is when we eat something, we don't have a pointer or laser, nothing, okay. Yeah. So when we eat something, the glucose level in the blood goes up, pancreas gets stimulated and makes insulin. The insulin basically takes the glucose from the blood and puts it in the liver or the tissues in a form of glycogen. Okay? So insulin basically takes the glucose out of the blood inside the tissues, whereas the counter-regulatory hormones takes the glucose from the tissues, from glycogen, from fat, etc., and puts it back in the blood. Okay? So how does that happen? So insulin kind of works as a key. Without insulin, glucose cannot enter inside the cell. Now, if you think about this bottom part as a muscle tissue and the top part as a blood, and you have few locks here. You have glucose transporter, you have insulin receptor. Insulin works as a key. When it binds to this insulin receptor, it opens up the glucose transporter channels, and it allows the glucose to come from the blood inside the cell. When it enters the cell, it works as a fuel for the tissue, so the muscle can function. Whichever tissue it enters, it can function. And the excess amount of glucose then gets stored as a glycogen or gets converted into fatty acid. Okay? Following me so far? Good. The only other thing apart from insulin that can open up these channels is exercise. When you exercise, you don't need insulin for the glucose to enter inside the cell. Exercise itself will open up these channels and will allow the glucose to come inside the cell, which means exercise can lower your blood glucose level as well. How does insulin secretion happen in physiological sense? So we have this background or basal insulin that's in throughout 24 hours, and with each meal there is this bolus insulin surge. So someone without diabetes has always got this background insulin, and every time they eat something, there's surge of insulin. And that's what pretty much we try to do these days with type 1 diabetes. Most of you must be in taking insulin regimen that takes background insulin, which is Lantus or Levemir, and you have short-acting insulin, which could be your Novorapid, Apidra, or Humalog. Okay? So in a nutshell, physiologically, so someone without diabetes, whenever their blood glucose goes up, insulin gets secreted and brings the blood glucose level down. When the blood glucose is low, glucagon gets secreted from pancreas and it brings blood glucose level up. So there is always this blood glucose maintained within the normal range. So what happens with exercise? Now this is an important thing to remember, because when you do exercise, you need fuel. Now the fuel can be in form of glucose or from free fatty acid. It can come from glycogen from inside the liver, inside the muscles. It can come from the fat or triglyceride from muscles or liver, etc. So there are a variety of sources of fuel when you do exercise. When you do low intensity exercise at the beginning, or a short duration of exercise, it's the free fatty acid that's used as a fuel. So if you go for a small walk with your dog, 10-minute walk and come back, you're not going to use a lot of glucose. It's likely that you're going to use free fatty acid. But as you increase the intensity of exercise, you will start using the glucose. So you'll be using the plasma glucose or the glucose that's in the blood, or you'll be using the glucose that's stored in the muscle or the tissues. Okay? So the highest intensity will use a lot of glucose. So when you do that exercise, high intensity, long duration exercise, that's when your glucose is going to drop down significantly. Just remember that. Now this is the example of someone, actually few people, working on exercise bike, so stationary exercise bike, and they had the intensity measured and the blood glucose uptake by the leg muscle measured as well. So as you can see initially, when someone does, so green is a low intensity, pink is the moderate intensity, and the blue is the severe intense exercise. And in the bottom here is the duration. So when someone does small duration, small intensity exercise, the glucose drop is minimal. Whereas someone does very high intense exercise, and especially long duration, their muscle, the glucose uptake by the muscle is very large. Okay? We know that there are two main categories of exercise, aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise is when there's a repeated and continuous movement of the same large muscle group. So that's your typical running, jogging, swimming, etc. Whereas anaerobic exercise is a powerful burst of activity requiring a large amount of energy input, but sustained for a short period of time. So that's where you have sprinting or weightlifting or plyometrics exercise, etc. There are a variety of beneficial effects of exercise, and this is a busy slide, but if you think about what happens to your cardiovascular system, when you start doing exercise regularly, your fitness level goes up, your resting heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down. These are all beneficial effects. Okay? When you think about the effects on cholesterol, your bad cholesterol goes down and your good cholesterol goes up. So it's good for the cholesterol as well. Anthropometric measures, your body mass is reducing, your chest is increasing, you pretty much look sexier when you do exercise, isn't it? It is really good for your metabolic profile as well. It increases the insulin sensitivity. And insulin sensitivity pretty much means that whatever insulin you're taking is all helping the glucose level to come under control, as opposed to people with obesity, and especially in type 2 diabetes, who have amount of insulin resistance, so they have to overcome the insulin resistance for that insulin to work. It is very good for your psychological health. It reduces the anxiety level, it reduces the depression, and it increases your self-esteem, doesn't it? So overall, exercise is a good thing, and there is no excuse not to exercise. Okay? So what I'm going to talk about now is what acutely happens after aerobic and anaerobic exercise. What happens immediately? So I'm going to take you back to that slide. So when you start exercising, as I've explained to you earlier, you don't need that insulin to open up that glucose channels. Exercise itself is going to allow the glucose to enter inside the cell, isn't it? Insulin is not necessary. So in someone who does not have diabetes, when they do aerobic exercise, insulin is not working, exercise is going to drop the blood glucose level down, and as a response to that, your counter-regulatory hormones are going to kick in, especially glucagon, and will allow the blood glucose level to go up. So overall, you have normal blood glucose. What happens in type 1 diabetes is that exercise is going to drop down the blood glucose, but you still have insulin on board because you've taken your insulin regularly, isn't it? When your beta cells in pancreas are not working to produce insulin, your alpha cells are not working properly to make glucagon as well. So even though your blood glucose level is dropping down, your counter-regulatory hormones, your natural counter-regulatory hormones are not working very well, which means your blood glucose is not going to rise, and as a net effect, you will get hypoglycemia. So remember, aerobic exercise can cause hypoglycemia. What happens with anaerobic exercise? So again, someone without diabetes, when they do anaerobic exercise, the anaerobic exercise is a short burst of exercise. There is so much of adrenaline kicked in. So adrenaline plays a huge role in anaerobic exercise. And that being a counter-regulatory hormone is going to bring the blood glucose level up. And when the blood glucose level goes up, naturally the insulin is going to go up to bring the blood glucose level down, because someone without diabetes, there is always a tendency to maintain the normal blood glucose level. So if one kicks in, the other has to kick in to allow the normal blood glucose level. What happens in type 1 diabetes is that the adrenaline is kicking in, which is increasing the blood glucose level, but your insulin is not going to change because you've already taken insulin. You're not taking special insulin before you start exercising to drop the blood glucose level. So the net effect is going to be the blood glucose will be higher. So remember that. So acute effect of anaerobic exercise, your blood glucose level can go up. Make sense? So what can possibly happen? If you're doing low intensity, short duration exercise, the effect on the blood glucose is going to be minimal, right? Because you're going to use a free fatty acid, you're not going to use glucose. If you're doing low intensity, long duration aerobic exercise, the drop in the blood glucose is going to be significant. If you do high intensity, short duration, so anaerobic exercise, the effect on the blood glucose may be minimal. It may rise, but it's going to be minimal. When you do high intensity, long duration exercise, your blood glucose is initially going to go up because of the adrenaline, but eventually it's going to drop down. Once it's used all the glucose stored from the glycogen or the muscle, etc., eventually it's going to drop down. When you do mixed aerobic and anaerobic exercise, it initially may not drop too much, but watch out for later onset hypoglycemia. This is when the blood glucose level can drop down significantly a few hours later. Okay? Now I recognize that everyone's body is different, everyone's metabolism is different, so this principle does not basically apply to all of you, but this is the theory behind it. Okay? So these are the rules I came up with this week. Who has seen Fight Club? Who has seen Fight Club? It's a movie. Okay, so yeah, nearly a quarter of you. It's my favorite movie. So if you've seen Fight Club, it had 8 rules of Fight Club. So I've come up with those 8 rules when exercising with type 1 diabetes. What's rule number 1 for Fight Club? Do not talk about Fight Club. Rule number 2? You do not talk about Fight Club.
We haven't practiced this.
So the rule number 1 of exercising with type 1 diabetes, check your blood glucose before, during, and after exercise. Rule number 2, you must check your blood glucose before, during, and after exercise. This is the best way you will find out how your body responds to different types of exercise. Okay? Rule number 3, plan your exercise. If you plan your exercise, you can do a lot of things with your insulin, your snacking, your basal insulin, your bolus insulin, etc., which I'm going to talk about in subsequent slides. Planning is the best thing. Rule number 4, exercise with a buddy. Exercise with someone who knows about hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia, what to do with someone gets hypoglycemia, etc. Okay? And you feel safe as well that there is someone watching you as well. Rule number 5, keep the snacks handy and know the carbohydrate in the snack you've got. Rule number 6, do not exercise when you have ketones. Rule number 7, think about temporary reduction of your basal insulin in next 24 hours. Rule number 8, hydrate adequately and try to abstain alcohol, but at least do not binge on alcohol on the day you've exercised. Very important thing. Okay? If you follow all these 8 rules, then it makes it easier to follow the subsequent slides. So how often should you check your blood glucose? So 30 minutes before you start exercise, just before you start exercise, every 30 minutes, even during the exercise, especially at the end of exercise, and up to 2 or 3 hours. Now this is more blood glucose you check initially, more you learn how your blood glucose is going to behave with that particular exercise. So subsequently you may not have to do all of these blood glucose check, but definitely initially when you start exercise you should do more often. I'll put 30 minutes before in a gray because that specifically applies to when you're doing anaerobic exercise or when you're doing a competitive sports. So just a thought of exercise sometimes excites people and brings the blood glucose level up due to adrenaline. Okay? Some of you might have heard about continuous glucose monitoring system. So that's a device available. Some of the public actually all of the public hospitals in Adelaide, you can get the continuous glucose monitoring done. It's a tiny, flexible sensor that sits on your skin and abdomen, and it can measure the blood glucose level every 5 minutes for up to 7 or 10 days. The range it can measure is between 2 and 22 millimoles. So if it's someone's blood who has more than 22 millimoles, it won't measure that. But that allows you to understand how your blood glucose is trending, because if you've done your blood glucose 1 hour apart, and if it's at the beginning it's 7 millimoles, at the end it's 7 millimoles, you don't know whether it's stayed 7 to 7, or it's gone up to 15 and come down to 7, or it's gone down to 2 and come up to 7. Okay? So it's sort of an extra thing that you can find out with the CGMS that you can't find out with just your blood glucose monitoring. So when we get the CGMS report, it looks like this. So this is a 3-day profile of every 5-minute blood glucose measurement in 3 different colors, and it gives you an idea about how the blood glucose is going trending. So what should be the ideal blood glucose before you start exercise? If your blood glucose is somewhere between 7 and 12, it's quite safe to do exercise. If it's under 7, you need to have some snacking before you start exercising. If it's above 12 millimoles, you don't need to take insulin necessarily, but check your ketones. And if there's a ketone present in your blood, do not exercise. But if it's without the ketones, you can start exercising, but make sure you hydrate yourself really well. Okay? Because when the blood glucose level is very high, your blood is very concentrated, it's dehydrated, and it does not come down just by doing exercise. Okay, so how do you adjust the insulin based on the timing and duration? So if you're planning to do short activity, under 90 minutes, and if you're planning to do that within 2 hours of your meal, you should reduce your mealtime bolus insulin. So for example, if you're having breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning, and if you're planning to do exercise at 8:30 in the morning, which is within 2 hours of meal, then you reduce your breakfast short-acting insulin by half. Okay? But if you're planning to do exercise before your next meal or in between the meals, then reducing the bolus insulin is not going to make a huge difference. In that case, you need to do you need to take snacking before you exercise. Okay, so for example, if someone is doing exercise at 11 a.m. when they've had breakfast at 7 a.m. in the morning, there's no need to reduce your 7 a.m. short-acting insulin. But you just eat something before your 11 a.m. exercise. If you're planning to do exercise for more than 90 minutes, you need to do a lot of things. So if it's within 2 hours of your meal, you need to reduce your mealtime bolus. You may also need to reduce your basal insulin. You need to snack regularly and watch out for delayed onset of hypoglycemia. But if your activity is between meals or just before your next meal, you don't need to reduce your bolus insulin. Snack prior to exercise. Reduce your basal rate. Snack regularly during the exercise, and watch out for delayed onset of hypoglycemia. So we talked about reducing bolus at the mealtime. How much bolus you should reduce? And that again depends on whether you're doing short duration exercise, moderate duration exercise, or long duration exercise, and whether you're doing low intensity, moderate intensity, or high intensity exercise. So for example, if someone is doing low intensity, short duration exercise, you may need to just reduce your bolus insulin by 10%. So if someone is taking 10 units of NovoRapid with the breakfast, you just take 9 units of NovoRapid with breakfast. Similarly, if someone is doing long duration, high intensity exercise, you need to reduce your bolus insulin by 2/3. So if someone is taking 9 units of NovoRapid in the morning, you take 3 units of NovoRapid in the morning. Okay? And these are just simple principles. Obviously, everyone's different, but this is how you start, and then you increase or reduce your bolus based on how your blood glucose is going to change. Okay? So how should you snack before exercise? Should you have a large amount of snack, or you should have a moderate amount of snack? So when you take a very large amount of food before you exercise, and then you think that that's going to sustain during the entire exercise, what typically happens is your blood glucose level is going to go up very high, and it's going to drop down significantly after the exercise. As opposed to when you take frequent small amount of snacking, it's going to maintain your blood glucose within the target range. Okay? So how much carbohydrates you should have with your snack? And this is something that one of the diabetes educators in the United States come up with. Gary Schneider is his name. And this is based on your weight and exercise. So for example, if you weigh 68 kilograms, and if you're doing light activity, your carbohydrates should be 8 grams. That's how you start with, and then you adjust based on your blood glucose. So you start with 8 grams of carbohydrates, and you continue taking 8 grams of carbohydrates every half an hour. And the reason why these numbers are 23, 45, 68, 91 is because Gary is from US, and these are all numbers from pounds. So 50 pounds, 100 pounds, 150 pounds, 200 pounds. So I've just converted them into kilograms. So how much basal insulin you should reduce? So basal insulin is your Lantus or Levemir if you're taking subcutaneous insulin, or what's in your pump in basal rate. If you're doing less than 90 minutes of exercise, you don't need to reduce your basal insulin. The reason is because it often leads to significant hyperglycemia after the end of exercise. If you're doing more than 90 minutes of exercise, your Lantus or Levemir needs to be reduced by 10 to 20%. Now again, if you've planned that already, and if you're doing that exercise in the morning, you reduce your dose the night before or in the morning of that exercise, whichever time you take them. If you're doing very long exercise, you need to reduce your Lantus or Levemir by 25%. If you're on a pump, try not to disconnect the pump, and I'll show you later on why. But you reduce your rate by 50% starting 1 hour before your exercise, and put it back to normal rate before you finish your exercise. If you're planning to do very long exercise, then you reduce your basal rate by 50% during the daytime and reduce by 25% during night. Okay? Now the next few slides are for those people who are on insulin pump. And the reason why I had this slide is to explain why you should not disconnect your insulin pump, because a lot of patients come and see me and they say they just don't like this pump attached to them when they're doing exercise, they're jumping around, they're walking around, and they often disconnect the insulin pump. Now if you think about the insulin pump, the basal insulin is made up of a series of lots and lots of bolus insulin. So basically, if you're taking bolus insulin, it starts here, goes up to the maximum, and gets out of your body within an hour or so. And you have frequent boluses happening throughout the day. And that allows your maximum insulin level to be quite steady. When you're planning to do half an hour exercise and you disconnect your pump for that half an hour, what you're going to do is you're not going to have any insulin boluses. There's no insulin boluses at this time, which means that your maximum insulin level is going to come down. But if you think about it, it's going to dip at the end of exercise, which means by the time you finish your exercise, that's when your insulin is low and your blood glucose is going to start coming up very high. If you're planning to do 2 hours of exercise and if you've disconnected for those 2 hours, again, your dip is going to be quite late. And what's going to happen is when you finish your exercise, you have pretty much no insulin left. Okay? When you have no insulin left, what's going to happen? You're going to get hyperglycemia. You may get ketones as well. Rather than disconnecting, if you had reduced your temporary rate by 50%, which means that you're getting this 50% of frequent boluses, what's going to happen is that it's going to dip, but at the time when you're doing exercise, which means by the time you finish your 2 hours of exercise, you've got quite a significant amount of insulin left, which is going to gradually build up. Okay? So that's why it's recommended that you don't disconnect your insulin pump while exercising. However, if there is no other choice, and if you had to disconnect your insulin pump, then the recommendation is that every hour you reconnect and give yourself a little bit of bolus, which means by the time you finish your exercise, you've still got some insulin left in you. All right. So those slides were only for those people who have got insulin pump. Coming back to hypoglycemia. Now, most of you are aware of the symptoms of hypoglycemia. This is what you need to tell your body about what to expect with hypoglycemia. You can get shaking, sweating, feeling anxiety, hungry, heartbeat goes up, you feel like you're getting palpitations, headache, irritability. All of these are typical symptoms of hypoglycemia. And you want to maintain these symptoms, okay? The risk of hypoglycemia is usually immediately after exercise, but it can last up to 24 hours, 36 hours after the exercise. And also remember that if you get one episode of hypoglycemia, it can blunt the response of your hypoglycemia subsequent times. So avoiding the hypoglycemia in the first place is very important. Okay. Also remember about hypoglycemia can occur in 2 different phases, so biphasic, so immediately after you finish your exercise, and again, quite late in the middle of the night as well. So watch out for not doing it right, but delayed onset of hypoglycemia. Delayed onset of hypoglycemia occurs following high intensity exercise or extended duration of activity. It may occur up to 24 hours afterwards. And the reason is very simple that I've explained to you earlier. When you do high intensity, long duration exercise, your glucose proportion as a fuel increases significantly. In fact, if you're doing very long duration, very high intensity exercise, as you can see here, nearly 80% of your fuel comes from glucose, either from the blood or from the muscle glycogen or the tissue glycogen. How do you prevent that? Keep the record, check your blood glucose regularly, understand when it happens, and decrease your basal insulin modestly, or have meal or snack boluses post-activity. Okay? It's also important to prevent hyperglycemia. So remember, with some anaerobic exercise, short burst exercise, you can get hyperglycemia. If you know that you're going to get hyperglycemia, usually you don't need any change in your basal insulin, but you may require some bolus insulin change. If you are planning to do short duration exercise, and if you know that with one particular exercise your blood glucose is going to go up, you take extra 50% of your correction dose. So I'm hoping that most of you know about correction boluses. That's the insulin, short-acting insulin that changes your blood glucose by how many millimoles. If you're planning to do moderate duration of exercise, you take 25% of correction in bolus insulin. But if you're planning to do long duration anaerobic exercise, you don't take extra bolus because you know that eventually your blood glucose is going to drop down. It's also important to avoid dehydration because when you're dehydrated, your blood volume is lower and it just gives you the impression your blood glucose is high. But it's not used properly as a fuel because you need the water to allow the fat and glucose to be converted into energy. Okay, so drinking before and after exercise is very important, especially when you're doing extended hours of exercise. What the hell is ketone? So ketone is that nasty thing we all hear about. So I've told you that in a different slide that insulin basically allows the glucose to enter the cell, and glucose is used as a fuel, as an energy for the cell to function. Fatty acid is another fuel that's used for the cell function. Now, the byproduct of fatty acid is ketones. Okay? If you have no insulin, if you've forgotten to take insulin, that glucose is not going to come inside the cell, which means you have very high blood glucose, but it's not working as a fuel. Which means that you have these ketones which are working as a fuel. So your fatty acid is working as a fuel. So you are taking up all the fatty acid from the tissue for the cellular function. And more fatty acid you use, more and more ketones you will produce. And these ketones are quite toxic to the cell. And finally, I've got a few slides about exercise with complications of diabetes. Now, most of you have heard about the complications of diabetes. You can get those small blood vessel and large blood vessel complication. The small blood vessel problem are usually neuropathy or nerve problem, retinopathy or the eye problem, or nephropathy, which is a kidney problem. And large blood vessel problem are usually the heart, stroke, and amputation and that sort of thing. So there is a recommendation of what exercise you should and should not do with these complications. So if you have autonomic neuropathy pretty much means that you have an autonomic system, nerve system, which is not working, and that autonomic nerve system is important to change your blood pressure. So when you're lying down and when you stand up, your blood pressure should come up. But if you have autonomic neuropathy, your blood pressure does not come up, actually drops down. So when you stand up, you actually have a tendency to fall. Similarly, a condition called gastroparesis, so the nerves around the stomach are not working, which means the food is not transiting from stomach to the intestine. It stays in stomach for long, and you get bloatiness, vomiting, and gastrointestinal symptoms soon after eating something. Peripheral neuropathy, or those ulcers in your feet that you get checked for by podiatrist. Nerve sensation problem in your feet. If you have those things, you should try to avoid the balance exercise. So there are the exercise listed here in the bottom. You should avoid doing treadmill, prolonged walking, jogging, and step exercises. But what's recommended is that you do swimming, bicycling, rowing, etc. Nephropathy or kidney problems. Sometimes your GPs or specialists would tell you that we are screening you for protein leakage in your urine. If you have that problem, the most important thing is to control your blood pressure. So again, you don't want to do any exercise that can increase your blood pressure, such as resistant exercise, anaerobic exercise, or some aerobic exercise. If you have retinopathy or the eye damage, depending on the degree of the eye damage, you want to avoid certain exercise, especially that can increase the pressure inside the eye. So anaerobic exercise especially, you want to avoid them. Okay. Now, I didn't want to put the slide of the plane today, but I've been carrying this slide for a long time. And I just wanted to explain that type 1 diabetes is like flying a plane, okay? If you've suddenly got a pilot's license and if you have no training, most likely you're going to crash your plane, isn't it? But if with proper precautions and training, you can fly really well. So imagine this is you, and we're going to talk about the 8 rules. Without those 8 rules, you're not going to fly the plane. Rule number 1, check blood glucose. Rule number 2, must check your blood glucose. Plan your exercise. Find a buddy. Keep the snacks handy. Check ketones. Think about reducing your temporary basal rate. Remain hydrated. Okay, and so you sometimes need a co-pilot, a very good co-pilot. Take help from your diabetes educator, your dietitian, your GP, and the specialist. If you do that, it can be easy. Okay? Thank you.